I Hate Politics is a podcast about a human activity we love to hate. I am Sunil Dasgupta. This upcoming Tuesday, November 8th, is the midterm elections that will determine who controls the House of Representatives and the Senate, but also a number of state governors' offices and assemblies. In Maryland, Democrat Wes Moore is in a lopsided race with Trump Republican Dan Cox, who has been repudiated by the sitting Republican governor of Maryland, Larry Hogan. Further down ballot in Montgomery County, for the Democratic County Executive and Democratic County Council candidates, the general elections are a chore. Because the county is so heavily Democratic, the primary elections in July were more important. Given that Montgomery County is likely to vote heavily Democratic, the most important race on the Montgomery County ballot is perhaps the Board of Education, which is a nonpartisan race, and voters cannot easily use party identification to help them make their choice. Last week on the podcast, we featured Carla Silvestri and Valerie Cole, who are running for the Board of Education. Earlier in the primary season, we had Julie Yang and Scott Joftis on the show. Listening back to those interviews should help you make your choice. But listening back will take 2 hours of your time. Is making a good voting choice for the Board of Education worth the 2 hours it'll take to learn about the candidates? Now, take the next step. What if those who don't know about politics and political issues believe they do know, and then act accordingly? In this episode, I talk with UMBC political scientist Ian Anson about his survey research findings on how much people know about politics and how much they think they know. I Hate Politics is a podcast about our neighborhoods, workplaces, schools and streets, and our local governments as they function in diverse and democratic societies. This means our politics are messy, dirty, sometimes corrupt, with often self-serving politicians. But no matter how much we hate politics, we are never exempt from it, even when we refuse to participate. In fact, the purpose of politics is to keep society moving precisely when we don't agree with each other, like now. Music for this episode comes from A Shrewdness of Apes, a Washington, D.C. area progressive rock band that has been a finalist for the local Whammy Awards in the hard rock category for a number of years. Ian Mabley on vocals and guitar, Chris Shadow on vocals and bass, and J.R. Franks on the drums. They are releasing a new acoustic EP called Embers at the Runaway on November 4th. More information on their website, asoaband.com. You're listening to I Hate Politics. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. In the news, a few days after rapper Kanye West unloaded yet again on Jews, the Montgomery County Council passed a resolution adopting a definition of antisemitism that advocates hope will set clear boundaries for hate speech against Jews and Judaism. The county has been weighing the resolution for about 4 months now, but Kanye's words added urgency.
I didn't realize that it was anti-Semitic to say, hey, I have a Jewish attorney. I have a Jewish record label. I have a Jewish contractor. The thing about the red hat that drove me to a point of exhaustion, which was misdiagnosed by I'm not going to say what race, what people, doctor, and what hospital, and what media it went to. We know I can't say that. It was a Jewish doctor.
Montgomery County's resolution affirms a definition of anti-Semitism that includes stereotyping like Kanye did, and was written by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance and supported by leading Jewish groups such as the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Congress, the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Washington, and the pulpits of some of the best-known synagogues in the region. The rise in anti-Semitic incidents in the U.S. and the world is clear. There has been an increase in harassment and vandalism against Jews, even in Montgomery County and in Maryland. The IHRA definition has existed for 15 years, but Jewish groups and supporters have made its adoption by local jurisdictions a priority over the last year. Councilmember Andrew Friedson, who supported the resolution in Montgomery, emphasized its educational and non-binding nature. This is not law. Anti-Semitism will continue to be prosecuted under existing hate crime legislation, but the belief is that hate speech leads to hate crimes, and understanding what constitutes hate speech will cause people not to use it or to stop other people from using it. Those who oppose the adoption of the definition say that the definition conflates criticism of the state of Israel with anti-Semitism, and they are apprehensive that there would be a chilling effect on public disagreements with Israeli policy over settlements or Israel's treatment of Palestinians or criticism of Benjamin Netanyahu. The opposition has included progressive Jews, including Jews United for Justice, leaders of some synagogues, and local Muslim groups. The Union of Reform Judaism, one of the largest Jewish groups in the United States, supported the resolution but also voiced disagreements with its content. In the region, Washington, D.C. and Arlington have already adopted the IHRA definition, with the exception that they did not include a set of examples that are considered by opponents to be the real sticking point. Expecting emotional and battling testimonies, the County Council did not allow public comment on the resolution, which brought criticism of the process itself. Here is Councilmember Will Joando.
No matter what the outcome today, harm will be done. I want to express my dismay in the process that led us to today's vote. It's true that we do not typically have public input on resolutions. However, as we have seen from the amount of correspondence and the presence of so many here today, this resolution is on an issue that is deeply important to many, many residents. And I strongly believe, however, that I must still vote for this resolution because of the larger shared principle and stand against anti-Semitism, even if I don't agree with every word or the process that led to it. The only acceptable message this council can send is voting for this resolution unanimously.
You can tell from Joando's words that not voting for an anti-Semitism resolution is simply not a politically feasible position, and would send the message that the county leadership was divided on the issue. One way to look at the resolution is to see it primarily as a way of committing current and future leadership of the county, its public schools, and other government and quasi-government bodies to standards and to prescribe hate speech that has turned deadly in the past. 2 weeks back, we looked at MCPS's upcoming capital improvement plan. The plan is now out. Some schools we did not expect movement on, such as Easton Middle School and Piney Branch Elementary School, have received initial planning funds, which is step one towards inclusion in the building list. Overall, the capital budget is $151 million more over the 6-year period than last year's estimates. The county has been reducing its bonding level since 2019. From a high of just over $2 billion, the county has revised downward by about $320 million over the capital budget's 6-year cycle. Annually, the number has gone down from $320 million in 2021 to $290 million for the upcoming fiscal year. What is truly dramatic about the plan are the project cost increases. The new Woodward High School, for example, which was estimated to cost $125 million in 2019, is now expected to cost $196 million. This is just astounding and certainly beats any measure of inflation available. Recently, the Maryland Department of Legislative Services conducted an audit of MCPS, and a central critique in that report is that MCPS does not have adequate contract performance monitoring processes which would allow MCPS to understand contract cost changes. I want to thank Laura Stewart, a leader of the county PTA organization, in helping me find the capital budget data. Lastly, it is college application season, and the University of Maryland, among other state schools around the country, have announced that they will meet the tuition costs for all in-state students. Worth clarifying what this means. This means that the university will meet the difference between their advertised tuition costs and the estimated family contribution as determined by the free application for federal student aid, the FAFSA form. The form has a way of calculating estimated family contribution. So at Maryland, in-state tuition is roughly $11,000. The maximum Pell Grant, the type of student aid that does not need to be paid back, is less than $7,000 a year. So the university will cover the $4,000 gap. Conversely, if a family's estimated contribution is above $11,000, then those families are considered not to have that need. Very roughly, assuming one child in school to get $7,000 in Pell Grants, the student's family will have to have a household income of less than $70,000. A family at the median Montgomery County household income, which is $110,000, will most likely have estimated family contribution of over $11,000, which is the in-state tuition level. I'm holding many things constant here to make these calculations, but important to point out that the squeeze in college tuition is really in the middle, not so much at the bottom, and it is easier to deal with at the top. The average family income in Montgomery County, as opposed to the median family income, as reported by the county to its bond rating agencies, is a whopping $250,000 a year. FAFSA also makes no distinction between those who live in high-rent Montgomery County and others who make the same income but live in, say, Hagerstown. You're listening to I Hate Politics. I am Sunil Dasgupta. I'll be back with political scientist Ian Anson to talk about his research on political knowledge. Ian Anson, welcome to I Hate Politics.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. Although, of course, as a political scientist, sometimes, but not always, I do really hate politics.
You know what I found out? That politicians hate politics most of all. Yeah, it's kind of really incredible position to take. Okay, you have a very interesting argument that says that Americans don't know enough about politics. but nevertheless feel confident in their knowledge? Can you explain your argument?
I certainly don't want to make the case that people can't acquire political knowledge. They don't have the capabilities, right? I mean, people are very capable of navigating all kinds of really big problems in their own daily lives, right? I don't want to claim that people can't acquire knowledge. That's an important point. But a lot of the time they don't. And I think unpacking sort of some of the reasons why that is a separate question, an important one. But for the purposes of my argument, I've sort of arrived at this discovery that, much in line with some existing research in the educational sphere, it turns out that people who are lacking in basic knowledge of sort of the facts of politics, some of them tend to be extremely confident in that knowledge, believing that they know a lot more than other people in their lives. And so again, leaving aside the critique maybe of the American public that people are, stupid or they don't know enough, that's not really an argument that I'm trying to make. What I'm trying to say is that there's a group of individuals in American society that simply believe themselves to be political experts when they're not. And that has, I think, a lot of implications, downstream implications for the way that we talk to each other, for the way that we engage across sort of partisan groups, and the way that we eventually leverage information to do things like choose candidates, right? And we'll probably see that come to bear in this upcoming election.
When you say many of us are experts when we are not, we believe we are experts when we are not, do you think this is a particularly new phenomenon that has to do with the democratization of the media?
I wish that I had the ability to answer it more conclusively using the data that I use in my studies, but we just really don't have the ability to test over time variation in this yet. But I think there's a lot of reason why we might speculate that there is potentially an increase in this phenomenon over time. I mean, for one thing, I think a really big piece of this that can't be ignored, the notion that when we're communicating online, and especially when we're communicating in an impersonal online setting with conditions of anonymity, it's actually a really effective move, basically, in that online space to have a stance, right, or a sort of a communication mentality of confidence, right? When you project that confidence into the anonymous online space, people listen to you. And so there's a lot of studies that have sort of shown that this is a feature of this information environment, and especially when it's very difficult for users to evaluate the sort of identities of the individuals who are communicating that information. And so essentially, it's a leveling tool where anybody can communicate, anybody can participate, which is, more participation in these kinds of discussions can be positive. But what it's teaching people, I think, is essentially that acting like a lot is a way to get attention and a way to get people to agree with you. And so it may be, and I don't want to overstate the case, because again, we don't have the data to be able to test these claims, but I could imagine that teaching people in successive online interactions that be like sounding confident when you really don't know what you're talking about, right, is brings with it these positive outcomes for your communication. That could have implications for the way that we communicate in real life when we're having face-to-face interactions with our peers.
So, I mean, is this then a case for more skeptical consumption of online content? Is that part of the solution here?
Yeah, I think that it could be. I really do think that this is a problem, if we've identified it, if we think that it's real. And again, right, these are empirical claims. So, all of this could be an artifact of the data that we've collected thus far. But if it turns out to be the fact that a lot of Americans are sort of severely overconfident in their knowledge of politics, the question of what do we do about this is a really difficult one, right? And I mean, yeah, we could think about ways that we might incentivize or encourage people to, especially in their online communication, but also offline, engage in discussions with a little bit more humility. I mean, certainly I think about that when I'm engaged in teaching, thinking about how to convey my knowledge of politics or to convey expertise without coming across as this sort of overbearing force, right? Allowing room for experimentation, allowing room for people to be wrong as well. That's a hard thing to engender, I think, in a discussion space that's not sort of closely monitored.
It's even harder because the algorithms are
Right.
designed exactly against it. I mean,
Perhaps, yeah.
So, I mean, I know you write that Twitter and Facebook, for example, ask you, have you read the article before you share it, right?
Right.
So
yeah, that's one maybe small step, right?
I think you're right. It does have an effect. The rest of the algorithm is designed exactly in the opposite direction.
You have to take into consideration the fact that these companies are in a competitive space. They're trying to obtain attention, and they're trying to get people to use their platforms as much as possible. And to do that, they're trying to serve people content in using algorithms, right? That's going to come to the top of their page whenever they turn on their device and access that. It's going to be the most attention grabbing, the most likely to engage some kind of emotional reaction. And, you know, the algorithm is always changing, and it varies across these various platforms. So I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush. I know that there's a lot of, social scientists, actually, even political scientists, who have left the field and are now working for some of these companies and thinking carefully about these subjects.
Can you speculate whether there are race and gender divisions around this?
So we know from the literature in behavioral economics, for example, that men are much more likely to invest in risky stock choices than women. Women are much more conservative in their investing behavior compared to men. And a lot of that literature that's looked at this has made the argument essentially that on average, on balance, men who engage in investment behavior believe themselves to have more knowledge of the market than women do, even though their knowledge of the economic fundamentals may be fairly equivalent. And in fact, given that the stock market is more or less a random walk, right, it's very hard to have, unless you're insider trading or something, to have a lot of information that's going to privilege your positions in the market over the long run. Certainly, there may be some case for a gender difference in people's willingness to engage in political overconfidence.
You talk about party identification in some of your research as a mediating factor in how overconfident and how not overconfident. Can you explain that?
Sure. Yeah, definitely. I mean, so this is kind of one of the bigger reasons why I am trying to call this phenomenon to the attention of scholars and the public, because this is where I think the phenomenon gets kind of pernicious, is the notion that as you ratchet up partisanship and as the discourse even that you're engaging in becomes more partisan in nature, people are more and more likely to try to defend their self-esteem by adopting an overconfident stance. And so in some of the experiments that I've done, I've had essentially some tasks for people to do where they engage in rating other people's performance on a political knowledge quiz. And so I'll give respondents in this online experimental setting, I'll give them a bunch of sort of answers that people, online people have provided. Of course, these are fake sort of online responses that I've generated myself for the purposes of controlling the experiment. So I show them these answers and I ask the individuals to rate how competent they think these people are, how knowledgeable they think they are about politics. And as it turns out, when you get Republicans and Democrats to evaluate these fictitious people, and you give them some demographic information about those people, when you do it, if you tell them they're a Democrat or a Republican, all of a sudden you see, as you might expect, right, a lot of bias coming in here, where Republicans will say that the Democrats have very low political knowledge, even though in all of these conditions, the answer key shows that they've gotten all the answers correct, right? And then, of course, vice versa for the other sort of party pairs, right? So the Democrats evaluate Republicans as bad, Republicans evaluate Democrats as bad. But critically, and this is the important distinction that I want to draw, is that it's only among politically overconfident people that this takes shape, this pattern takes shape. Among people who really do possess a lot of political knowledge and are accurate in their appraisals of themselves, they also are unlikely to use those party labels to make judgments of others that are biased. And so what that really shows us is that the political overconfidence phenomenon actually also not only changes our relationship with any peer that we're talking about, but it really even more strongly impacts the kinds of discussions we have when we're talking across the aisle, when we're having a communication with an out partisan. And so this is, I think, one of the features perhaps of our day-to-day communications that we have with Americans, where when our political hackles are raised, right, it's these specifically overconfident people that are the ones that are most likely to just purely talk past one another, because they don't merit the points that the other person is making, because they believe them to have no competent ability to understand politics.
So not only do we have overconfidence in our ability, but we have underconfidence in the ability of out partisans to understand the political situation.
Right. We essentially say, oh, that person doesn't know a thing.
Because
right?
they are Democrats or Republicans.
Exactly. And of course, that's a really big problem, especially when in all these treatments, objectively, the fictional person that they're evaluating is highly competent. And so, even if somebody knows a ton and is trying to be sort of compassionate in helping them to understand the political system in a better way, all of that information gets discounted. It's basically in one ear, out the other. And so this is, I think, a reason why, especially in the partisan space, certain misperceptions can perpetuate. Of course, we don't talk to each other across the aisle that much anyway. That's maybe another, broader issue. But when we finally do have that point of contact where we can have discussions that are sort of cross-party in nature, for a certain, subset of the American public, it's really, like I said, one ear, out the other.
In your sample, what is the percentage of people that are overconfident versus the percentage of people that are not overconfident in your measurement?
In the studies that I've done, we've seen pretty consistent evidence that, between like 60% and plus are at least a little bit overconfident in their political knowledge. Sometimes up to 70% of people in the sample are overconfident. They believe themselves to be more knowledgeable than they really are. Of course, that's a matter of degree, right? There's probably, I'd say, a chunk of people who are maybe 20, 30% of the sample that are sort of severely overconfident, where they're doing extremely poorly on objective assessments and believing themselves to be like top 10%.
What about demographic breakdown of that sample?
We do see that essentially young, I'd say that the demographic profile is sort of young white men are probably the most likely to fall into that category of the sort of severely overconfident.
Oh, I'm surprised, because I thought old white men would be even worse performing.
There is a little bit of an age component that tends to skew younger. And again, maybe that has something to do with, like I said, with that online information environment. But yeah, I think hopefully in the future, if I can get some really big grants to study this in a more robust way, we'll be able to make stronger claims about that age dynamic.
So what is the method that you use to do these experiments?
Right. So, so the method is essentially an online survey experimental design where I get, a couple of thousand people to respond to an experiment where I'm essentially varying people's essentially varying conditions that people see after taking a political knowledge quiz, a basic political knowledge quiz. And so the political knowledge quiz has 5 questions. The 5 questions usually tap things like people's knowledge of the rules of basic institutions. I'll often ask people, how many years as a senator serve in a single term in office. They also tap knowledge of political actors. So I ask people to identify, for example, like who's the vice president out of a lineup, something like that, or other political figures. And also questions about, for example, ideology. So I'll ask a question that's surprisingly difficult for a lot of Americans. I'll ask people which party is more conservative when it comes to healthcare, the Democrats, the Republicans. Many Americans do not understand ideology very well and tend to get that question wrong. And so those kinds of questions altogether, if you sort of build them together into a scale, which I've kind of validated, go to a long way to providing an objective measure of basically how much people know about the kind of political facts of the day. And from there, then I have a follow-up battery where I ask people, and this is kind of where some of the experimental stuff comes in, where I'll ask people a variety of different kinds of questions about how they thought they did. So I'll ask people things like, relative to everyone who's taken the survey, how well did you do? Would you rate your performance on some objective scale of excellent to poor? Other things like relative to, people in your community, relative to people, that you talk politics with every day, relative to Republicans and Democrats, right? I've asked a whole series of these kinds of comparative questions. And lo and behold, right, a lot of the time, even with the objective assessments, you'll see that those measures kind of outpace their real performance on the distribution of responses. And then from there, right, I'm able to do all kinds of interesting stuff now that I've essentially classified people as overconfident or not. That's where I've done things like I mentioned, where I'll show people a random quiz answer sheet from a fictional respondent and ask them to tell me how well they did. I've done a number of other things where, for example, I've exposed people to misinformation or to inoculations against misinformation, where I said, watch out, some of these things could be not true. And then I asked them to diagnose misinformation among a series of questions. And lo and behold, the people who are overconfident tend to ignore my warnings about overconfidence, partially because they believe that they are so knowledgeable that they don't need to listen. And so, there's a lot of downstream stuff that you can do with this kind of setup.
How underrepresentative is your sample from the US population based on the work that you've done?
Yeah, so it varies a little bit. So some of the work that I've done are using very unrepresentative samples that are sort of pure convenience recruitment samples that come off of platforms like Amazon MTurk. Others have come from survey firms that do make an effort to have basically provide you with a sample that is demographically matched. Again, like we can't make super strong claims because they're not randomly selected. Like, the fundamental kind of sampling the gold standard basically is that every individual in the sampling frame has an equal probability of being selected. That's not true of these things. It's not truly a random sample. Yeah, but because they're sort of recruited and then the panels are then invited to participate in specific surveys in a way that continues to, like, basically they fill in a way that the survey firm knows approximates a demographic balance, we do get pretty close.
Where does our politics go as a consequence of overconfidence? Not just where does the debate go?
The broad takeaway here is that if we have widespread overconfidence in a society, it is certainly not a break to polarization. It's probably instead an accelerant. And so that has a lot of consequences because we often think about polarization occurring, especially ideological polarization occurring among the most sophisticated members of the public, which is a little bit of a twist on, I think, what a lot of people might assume. Basically, in order to be polarized, you probably need to have some kind of strong political attachment to a political group. So very strong partisans tend to be a lot more informed about politics than others. And to be ideologically consistently polarized, right? If we go all the way back to the kinds of work that people like Philip Converse were, the claims that they were making in the 1960s, right? Very few people have really consistent, robust ideologies in America. However, the ones that do, they might be able to sort of develop increasingly extreme ideological positions as they follow the lead of elites that are also polarizing in our society. But this is actually making the case that people who are not well-versed in politics might also be susceptible to extreme position taking, especially if they, are exposed to politics a little bit and then believe that exposure, especially to extreme arguments, is sufficient to then, essentially engage in the political process robustly. And so, yeah, the broad takeaway is that, polarization could be growing in the society from top to bottom, basically, with this kind of finding.
Should this process not have occurred even prior to our study period? So in the 19th century? There's
no reason to suggest that this kind of thing hasn't already been happening for a long time. But I think that it's partisan elites that are generally the drivers of mainstream polarization in the American public, and especially what we've been seeing in terms of affective polarization. The fact that we simply don't like each other as much anymore. Partisan groups are not very pleased with one another. We still don't see widespread, mass ideological polarization in the electorate. That's still not something that we're seeing to a huge degree. Now, could it be growing. I mean, that's an argument for scholars of polarization. And maybe as political overconfidence continues, and again, I can't say that it's increasing or not. It may have been always a feature of the environment, but if it is increasing, then we might see again that kind of mass ideological position taking increase. But yeah, it's down to political elites as well to signal to citizens what kinds of positions they should take as well. Because if we've got people who have low awareness of politics and they do happen to poke their heads up every once in a while and kind of look around at the political space and they see these extreme positions being talked about, they might say, oh, I've learned all I need to know about politics today, these 2 or 3 extreme statements, and then sort of run with that and extrapolate from that to build an entire kind of political stance.
So there is good reason that people do in fact hate politics.
perhaps. Yeah, I mean, I think that's also an interesting angle to this. And I was thinking about this as I was getting ready to come talk to you today. Because there's kind of 2 divides in American politics. There's the left-right divide, but there's also the sort of on-off divide. And some scholars like Yana Krupnikov have been working on this at Stony Brook University for a while. There's a really huge difference between the kind of politically engaged, politics junkie kind of person, that might be even listening to this podcast despite the title. And, of course, a swath of the public who looks at politics and goes, oh, this is horrible to behold. And I can't even for a second withstand, the vitriol, the negativity, and the nastiness, right? Those kinds of people might not have a really strong grasp of politics because they're not engaging with it on a day-to-day basis. They don't have a lot of exposure to it. Could they be overconfident in their knowledge of politics? Possibly, but they're probably not going to engage in politics in that kind of polarized ideological way that we might expect for people who are sort of casual partisans or people who are just dabbling in politics, but nevertheless willing to take extreme positions. I mean, I think it does speak to kind of this core, potential critique or consideration here is that people have interests that they're trying to represent, that they're trying to present in conflict to others. They're standing up for what they need, basically, right? Politics is about who gets what, and they're trying to get what they're trying to get what they need, and to think that people are engaging in discussion and they're talking past each other and they're not listening to each other because they think they know a lot about politics, I think doesn't prevent people from talking past each other and expressing themselves loudly and expressing themselves forcefully, and still having something to say about their lived experience that's valuable, right? I don't want to claim that people who are overconfident about their political knowledge aren't people that have nothing to say. And I think that's a very important sort of caveat to the whole argument.
Prior to the primary, the 2022 primary, from the podcast, because we were being asked repeatedly about who to vote for, right? Yeah,
sure.
And so what we did was we created a voter app, an online voter app, on which you could choose your most important issue. Then it would ask you what disposition you preferred on that particular issue. We had a set of choices. And after doing that a few times, the app would auto-generate a slate for the voter.
Wow. That's so cool. Yeah.
I started doing this over the July 4th weekend, and we had this ready to go, I think July 8th, 9th, which is like 10 days before. We had 1,000 people take it. The problem we faced was that the app was designed for low information voters, but we could only reach low information voters if high information voters would recommend the app. At that time, it was too late to do Facebook advertising or whatever. But high information voters, because they chose differently, would disagree with the slates that they were getting. they would choose on very intimate knowledge of the candidate, of the issues, but it wasn't meant for them. It was meant for people that were just completely not involved.
Right.
And we had this huge realization about this point that you're trying to make, which is elites lead so much of this polarization. So much of the information available and what is not available is provided by elites.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. First of all, that you observed this in action, right? I mean, that's a very interesting political science research paper in itself, right? To be able to witness this, this transmission of information across political discussion networks, right? I mean, I think about discussion networks in general and just how rare it is that we have political discussion networks that, engage people with different politics today, because we tend to filter, right? But we do see, right, we might not have left-right cooperation in political discussion networks, but we probably do have on-off political discussion networks where we've got some people who are pretty tuned out and they still are willing to ask questions and talk politics with people who have more expertise. But yeah, it's fascinating to think that the experience of these lower information voters is so structured by the people in their networks. And that's kind of, I think, in line with the classic assumptions about political discussion networks that we might have had in the literature, maybe, even 40 years ago, when we started really studying these discussion networks, is that we have what was called opinion leaders. There are these knowledgeable people that tend to talk to their friends and colleagues about politics, and most of those friends and colleagues are sort of happy to listen and happy to use that as an information subsidy, right?
Right.
Now, so, I think in my work, what I'm claiming is that sometimes those opinion leaders appear to be opinion leaders, highly sophisticated opinion leaders, but in fact are no more knowledgeable than the followers, right? The opinion followers. And this could result in some really big issues. But I would say that there's definitely already a self-selection phenomenon where these are probably the truly sophisticated opinion leaders that are getting the app to then share, right? So if we were to randomly distribute the app to opinion leaders in discussion networks that we'd identified, I think we'd see a lot more of this, overconfidence problem come in. But I'm fascinated to think about what some of these individual interactions were like, where people were getting results and sharing these and saying, let me double check, is this right? Does this seem like the right thing? And having people who are, again, like you said, have intimate knowledge of these, local candidates going, oh, well, that guy, in 2012, I saw him, cut somebody off in traffic, and so he's a jerk, and you can't vote for right. That's a fascinating, I think, sort of second set of political knowledge, especially at the local level, that we can't assess very easily using the tools that we have in the studies like the ones that I've created.
Ian Anson, thank you very much for coming on I Hate Politics. I hope you'll come back as your research progresses.
Absolutely. And I hope that you'll also decide to come on Retrieving the Social Sciences. I'll just give a quick plug to the Center for Social Science Scholarship at UMBC and our podcast. So we talk about all kinds of research that is going on UMBC's campus. We talk about student projects and even projects that are going on not conducted by sort of faculty, but also by people at research centers and institutes. And we even talk about some of the research of visiting guests who are visiting UMBC from other universities.
What lessons can we draw from my conversation with UMBC political scientist Ian Anson? First, I want to reiterate Anson's caveat, especially since some of what he said fell off on the edit table. There is no implication here that voters, residents, ordinary folk are less capable of acquiring sophisticated political information. The rational ignorance hypothesis in political science says that for most people, it is not worth the time and effort to know more. There is public choice literature, which says that those who in fact know more tend to become information brokers and use that knowledge for their personal benefit rather than for public good. Akin to what Anson says about party elites driving polarization, presumably because they benefit with their own incumbency or perhaps more insidiously via corruption. Anson's argument focuses instead on the mismatch between knowledge and overconfidence, and in breaking down who tends to be more overconfident. But going beyond that immediate discussion, I want to highlight a larger question. What is the role of knowledge in politics? Democracies in particular have a strong belief in the idea that anyone can be a political leader. Like the chef from the movie Ratatouille, who says anyone can cook. Can they? If indeed we believe in this idea, then we might say that politics itself is a confidence game. As an ideal type, it involves Mr. Smith going to Washington. Mr. Smith doesn't quite know politics, but it is the very lack of political knowledge that makes him a better political leader than the professional politicians that surround Mr. Smith. I am certain many of the people on the Capitol grounds on January 6th, 2021, thought of themselves as Mr. Smith. So there is our belief that says anyone can lead, and there is the reality that doing politics is a really hard thing and requires specialist knowledge. There is a fake it till you make it American ethic we have seen from Alexander Hamilton to Elon Musk. So what if some of us are overconfident about our knowledge of politics? If you are ambitious, you are going to be overconfident. Anson might respond by saying that this narrative is not universally present or experienced across the U.S. population. That there is clustering of overconfidence among men over women, among young white men in particular. He did not identify Republicans or Democrats as being more or less overconfident, but that is a question I hope he will answer with his research in the future. And lastly, polarization may be an age-old problem, but still needs a solution now. We'll be following Anson's work closely. You may sometimes think your vote doesn't matter, but please don't skip November 8th. That's all for this episode. You've been listening to I Hate Politics. I am Sunil Dasgupta. Music for this episode comes from A Shrewdness of Apes, a Washington, D.C. area progressive rock band that has been a finalist for the local Whammy Awards in the hard rock category. Ian Mabley on vocals and guitar, Chris Shadow on vocals and bass, and J.R. Franks on the drums. They are releasing a new acoustic EP called Embers at the Runaway on November 4th. More information at their website, asoaband.com. If you want to share your music on the show or know someone else who might want to, please email us at ihppod@gmail.com or reach out on Twitter at ihppod. I hope you'll subscribe and share the podcast as we bring you stories about politics close to you and to your home. See you next time.